My name is Nora Vance. I'm 35, and I found out my mother had sold the orchard my grandfather left me when I saw strangers staking survey flags for a resort parking lot. 6 days later, I stood inside my sister's new $180,000 spa while my stolen inheritance paid for marble counters, imported robes, and champagne nobody there intended to remember. My mother raised her glass in front of nearly 100 guests and pulled my sister against her side. "We have to thank Nora," she announced. Her orchard funded the daughter who actually knew what to do with an investment. Then she laughed. The room laughed with her, because they all believed I'd agreed to the sale. My sister smiled at me over her glass, waiting for me to swallow the insult the way I always had. I smiled back instead. "Check your mailbox tomorrow," I said. My mother's expression cracked for less than a second. I saw it anyway. By 8 the next morning, my phone showed 61 missed calls. One voicemail opened with my mother crying, shifted into shouting, and cut off mid-sentence, "You can't take the spa. Your sister already." I listened to it once, set the phone face down, and opened the final document my attorney had sent me. My mother thought that letter was a threat. It was actually a map of everything she was about to lose. She'd forged my signature, rewritten my grandfather's wishes, and treated my silence like permission. What she didn't know was that while she was arranging champagne for a grand opening, I'd already arranged for every dollar to lead a court straight back to her. For years earlier, my grandfather Walter had left me Miller Creek Orchard, 22 acres outside Wenatchee, Washington, with the packing barn, water rights, and every debt attached to it. My mother, Renata, called it unfair. My younger sister, Sloane, called it wasted potential in my hands. Neither one mentioned that I'd spent 12 summers working beside Grandpa Walter while Sloane showed up only for photos among the trees. He taught me to check a Honeycrisp for give at the stem before trusting a brick's reading. "Numbers tell you when the fruit's ready," he used to say. "Care tells you whether the land survives you." Those words shaped my whole career. I work as a sustainable agriculture consultant, helping small growers cut water use and rebuild worn-out soil. I put almost every early dollar the orchard made back into irrigation repairs, erosion control, and organic certification. My mother only ever saw its resale value. Sloane saw money I was being selfish for leaving in the ground. The spa started as another one of Sloane's sudden reinventions. She'd left 3 jobs in 2 years before announcing that wellness retail was her true calling, and she showed up to dinner with a mood board instead of a business plan, a prime storefront, imported fixtures, a launch publicist, and a request for $180,000 from the family. My mother asked me to invest that same dinner, though the number had clearly already been decided before I sat down. I offered to review her projections, help negotiate the lease, and put in $18,000 once she had an actual budget and some independent financing lined up. Sloane pushed her chair back and said I was humiliating her. My mother told me Grandpa Walter had already given me more than enough, and that one sister shouldn't get to hold all the family's security. I told her the orchard wasn't family cash, it was legally mine, operationally fragile, and already supporting 5 employees. The conversation ended with my mother saying, "One day you'll learn land matters less than people." 3 months later, invitations went out for the grand opening of Lumen and Company, a spa whose existence, apparently, no longer required my cooperation. The first warning came 12 days before the opening. At 5:20 on a Monday morning, my bank flagged 2 failed attempts to log into the orchard's operating account from my mother's area. I changed every password and told myself it might have been an old shared login used by accident. At noon, I called Hector Reyes, the orchard manager Grandpa Walter had trained. Hector said a woman from a new ownership team had come by asking for water records and yield estimates. When I told him no such team existed, he admitted my mother had visited with paperwork carrying my signature, claiming I'd authorized a confidential sale and didn't want calls before the transition. Hector hadn't handed over the equipment keys, but he'd assumed there was some family arrangement nobody had told him about yet. My mother had used my own reputation for privacy against the people who trusted me. I drove out to Miller Creek that afternoon. Grandpa's hand-painted sign was gone. A temporary board read "Future Home of Cascade Peak Resort Retreat," and survey flags cut across the old gala block. The development director congratulated me on the sale. When I told him no sale had ever been authorized, his smile disappeared. His closing file showed a recorded deed transferring the orchard for $1.05 million, well under its recent valuation. My name sat at the bottom, but my middle initial was wrong. The notary acknowledgement placed me in Wenatchee on a day I'd actually been in Seattle presenting a water conservation proposal. I didn't cry in front of him. I photographed every page, asked him to pause all non-essential work, and got back in my car. My hands didn't start shaking until the door closed. I remembered standing with Grandpa at sunrise during my first real harvest, Watching him split an apple open and tell me ownership wasn't the right to use something up, it was the responsibility to leave it alive. My own mother had converted that responsibility into marble counters and imported robes. I pulled up her number, thumb hovering over the call button, some part of me still hoping she'd offer an explanation that let me stay her daughter. Then a new bank alert came through, another login attempt on the Orchard account. I locked the phone, started the car, and chose evidence over an explanation. The county recorder confirmed the deed had been filed 11 days earlier. The escrow file authorized my mother to communicate on my behalf and included an old, expired ID I'd stored in a locked cabinet at her house. She still had the spare key I'd given her years earlier after a burst pipe. I'd handed her access because she was my mother, and she'd treated that trust like a tool left lying around for anyone to pick up. The proceeds had moved into an account controlled by Renata Vance. $180,000 went straight to Lumen and Company, LLC. Another $104,000 covered debts and launch costs. More than $560,000 remained, but transfers were still pending. If I confronted her directly, she could scatter it before I got a court order in place. I called Priya Shah, an attorney I knew through agricultural land work. She promised no easy win. Cascade Peak had paid real money and believed the purchase was legitimate. The forged deed could be voided, but preserving the land and tracing the money required moving fast, quietly. She told me to document everything as an owner watching her asset get dismantled in real time. Priya filed a civil complaint and requested an emergency order freezing the sale proceeds and blocking further changes to the orchard. I rebuilt the timeline of the supposed signing day from calendars, card statements, hotel receipts, and a recording of my own Seattle presentation. The forged signature copied the full, formal name from my old passport, not the shortened version I actually used on business documents. I tracked down the notary listed on the deed. Her seal had expired 18 months earlier. She'd reported it lost after a move. Her affidavit turned suspicion into a documented act. Hector forwarded me the email that had instructed him to cooperate and stay quiet. It came from an address that looked like mine except for one letter in the domain, registered days before my mother's visit. Priya added it to our evidence request. She warned that all of this made a criminal referral likely. I wanted the orchard back in Cascade Peak, made whole. I didn't want my mother in prison. Your preference can influence the outcome, Priya said. It can't control it. A forged deed wasn't a private family matter anymore. The hardest piece came out of escrow itself. My mother had rushed the closing by claiming I was undergoing medical treatment and couldn't appear by video, asking staff not to contact me because stress might affect my recovery. Attached to the file was an email with Sloane's wire instructions. Sloane had written, "Send our portion first. The opening date can't move." My mother replied, "Nora will be upset, but by the time she figures it out, the store will already be open." Sloane answered with a heart emoji, "And you always find a way." Up until that message, I'd left room for the possibility that Sloane genuinely believed I'd agreed. That closed the door. She might not have forged anything herself, but she'd known the entire plan depended on moving before I found out. The judge scheduled our emergency hearing for 7:30 the morning after the grand opening. Priya wanted me to skip the event entirely. I decided to go, for two reasons. My mother had already told relatives and vendors I was a willing investor. If I disappeared, she'd say I'd changed my mind out of jealousy. And if I showed up, said nothing that confirmed her story, and let the legal process start right after the celebration, the money would stay exactly where we could still reach it, because she'd still believe I knew nothing. I wrote one letter, to be delivered with the filed notices right after the hearing. No insults, no plea for anything. It said the orchard was never hers to sell, my signature was never hers to borrow, and being my mother didn't put her above the law. The last line read, "You taught me silence means permission. Tomorrow, you'll learn the difference." Lumen and Company opened Thursday evening under strings of white lights and gold signage. Marble counters, imported robes hanging in a curtained styling room, a photographer working the floor, a lifestyle blogger doing interviews near the entrance. Every polished surface reflected some piece of Miller Creek. The reception desk represented an irrigation repair. The lighting fixtures equaled 2 seasons of a picker's health coverage. The inventory existed because my grandfather's trees had been converted into a forged signature. I wore a plain gray dress and came alone. My mother crossed the room immediately, kissed my cheek, and whispered that she was relieved I'd decided to be mature about it. Sloane joined us in a white robe from her own opening collection. Both of them studied me for a second, checking for any sign that I knew. I congratulated Sloane on the turnout and didn't mention the orchard once. Their shoulders relaxed. My mother handed me a glass of champagne bought with my own money. I held it without drinking. Guests kept thanking me for supporting my sister. One woman from the Merchants Association told me my investment proved that women lift each other up. Every compliment tightened something behind my ribs. They'd turned me into a witness for a lie and framed any objection as betrayal. At 6:45, while a violinist played near the fitting rooms, a court clerk accepted Priya's final filing across town. At 6:52, a courier picked up the sealed package with my letter and the notices set for delivery after the morning hearing. At 7 o'clock, Sloane tapped a spoon against her glass and stepped onto a small platform. The room quieted. She thanked her designers, her launch team, and my mother, the only person who believed in this from day one. My mother joined her up there, one arm around Sloane's waist, and then looked straight at me. "There's one more person we should thank," she said. Nora's always preferred dirt and spreadsheets to anything glamorous, but even she finally understood which daughter was worth the investment. A few guests laughed, unsure. My mother lifted her glass higher. "Her orchard made all of this possible. Thank you for finally investing in the daughter who deserved it." Applause rippled around me. The blogger turned her camera my way. People looked at me like I was a generous sister being honored, not an owner being mocked with the proceeds of her own stolen land. The humiliation was precise. My mother wasn't just hiding the fraud. She was making me endorse the exact hierarchy that had justified it. I felt the old instinct rise: keep the peace, protect her image, deal with my own hurt later, alone. Then I thought about Sloane's message. "You always find a way." I set my untouched champagne down on a passing tray and walked up to the platform. My mother smiled, expecting a toast back. I stopped close enough for the microphone to catch it. "Check your mailbox tomorrow," I said. The applause thinned into silence. My mother's eyes sharpened. Sloane's smile stayed fixed, but her hand closed hard around the edge of the podium. I didn't explain anything. I thanked the nearest staff member, grabbed my coat, and walked out while the photographer kept shooting. Behind me, my mother laughed too loudly and told everyone I was being dramatic about a family surprise. In the parking lot, Priya confirmed the emergency hearing was set for 7:30. Cascade Peak had voluntarily paused construction the moment they learned the deed was disputed. Everything now depended on the paper trail holding up, not on my mother admitting anything. At 7:25 the next morning, I sat beside Priya in a quiet courtroom. Cascade Peak's attorney appeared by video and confirmed the company would suspend all work while title was investigated. The judge reviewed the wrong middle initial, my Seattle records, the expired notary seal, the fake email address, and the transfer of proceeds into accounts my mother and Sloane's LLC controlled. At 8:12, she granted a temporary restraining order, barring further changes to Miller Creek, freezing the traceable balance from the sale, blocking Lumen and Company from moving high-value inventory outside normal operations, and recording notice that the orchard's title was under litigation. It didn't decide the whole case. It just made sure my mother couldn't scatter everything before the case could be heard. At 8:20, the courier delivered the package to my mother's front door and got her signature. 3 minutes later she called. I watched the phone light up until the screen went dark. Sloane called next, then my mother again. By 9, there were 21 missed calls. By 10:30, 61, 17 from Sloane, 34 from my mother, the rest from relatives who'd gotten some frantic version of the story secondhand. The first voicemail from my mother opened in tears. The deed had been a misunderstanding. She'd always planned to pay me back. Then her voice steadied and shifted. I'd humiliated Sloane, sabotaged a young business, waited until after the opening on purpose to make it hurt worse. In the last few seconds, the performance dropped entirely. "You can't take the spa. Sloane's already signed supplier guarantees. If the bank freezes that account, she loses everything. Call me before people find out what you did." Sloane's message claimed she genuinely believed I would eventually approve, and that the heart emoji didn't prove anything. She never apologized for spending the money. She listed the employees she'd hired, the lease she'd signed, the reputation I was supposedly wrecking. My mother's third message dropped the pleading entirely. She said Grandpa Walter would be ashamed to see me choose property over family. That's when I stopped listening. I set the phone face down and looked at the copy of my own letter instead. I hadn't chosen property over family. My mother had chosen Sloane's storefront over my consent, over Grandpa's wishes, over 5 orchard jobs, over the law. She called it love because love sounds better out loud than favoritism does. I muted every family number except Priya's and drove out to Miller Creek. Hector and the crew were waiting by the packing barn. I showed them the order and told them the orchard was protected while the court sorted out title. Nobody cheered. The trees still needed care, the crew still needed certainty, and Cascade Peak was out real money because of my mother too. It didn't feel like fireworks. It felt like finally refusing to absorb the cost so everyone else could stay comfortable. My mother demanded a family meeting. I agreed, on the condition it happened at Priya's office, recorded. My mother showed up dressed like appearance alone could still restore her authority. Sloane came with her boyfriend, Grant. My mother set my letter on the table and said the paperwork had just been handled badly. Priya set the deed next to the notary's affidavit. Bad paperwork doesn't fabricate an email address, steal someone's ID, invent a medical excuse, forge a notary seal, and move over $1 million. My mother said Grandpa Walter had wronged the family by leaving the orchard to one granddaughter, and that she'd simply corrected the injustice by investing where money could build a real future. I reminded her Miller Creek already had employees, contracts, and a conservation plan. She'd valued Sloane's dream because it came wrapped in gold lettering. Renata said I could always earn more, while Sloane needed a start. My competence had never earned me respect in that family. It had only made me easier to take from. Sloane denied knowing about the actual forgery. I slid her escrow email across the table, then a line from her own loan application, where she described the transfer as proceeds from a family orchard sale being finalized and certified it as accurate. Grant read the page and physically stepped back from her. I laid out my terms. Title restored. Cascade Peak as an innocent buyer made whole. Every traceable dollar returned. Spa assets bought with stolen proceeds staying under court supervision. My mother correcting her story to every relative, vendor, and guest who'd been told otherwise. Neither of them setting foot on Miller Creek without my written permission. I told the prosecutor I preferred restitution over incarceration, but I wouldn't withdraw evidence or call any of it a misunderstanding. My mother said I was asking her to lose her home. I told her she'd sold mine. Sloane said closing the spa would destroy her. I reminded her 5 orchard employees had found out through a stranger that their jobs might be bulldozed for a parking lot. Grant left before the meeting was over. Sloane followed him into the hallway. He didn't come back. The case took 8 months of mediation, forensic accounting, a formal title action. The deed was voided. My mother had never had any authority to transfer the orchard. Cascade Peak dropped its claim once the title insurer stepped in. The money trail was less forgiving than the paperwork. Of the $1.05 million, the freeze had preserved $580,000. Restitution meant my mother liquidating her investments, most of her retirement savings, and the house where she'd hosted every holiday for 20 years. After the mortgage and settlements, she moved into a 1-bedroom apartment above a dry cleaner. Lumen & Company lasted 7 weeks. It didn't collapse as punishment. A receiver identified the fixtures and inventory as assets bought with traced funds. The landlord terminated the lease over the disclosure breach, and suppliers came after the personal guarantees Sloane had signed without reading closely. The gold signage came down. Everything was auctioned toward restitution. Sloane stayed on the hook for $61,000, entered a payment plan, and took a job as an assistant manager at a mid-range retail chain. Grant ended things not long after, telling her the court documents had shown him a version of her he couldn't unsee. The DA wouldn't drop a publicly recorded forged deed. My mother avoided jail with no prior record, made restitution, and cooperated. 3 years of supervised probation, community service, financial crime counseling, and a permanent ban on acting as anyone's fiduciary. Sloane went through diversion for the false statement on her loan application and stayed liable for the debt. During the final mediation, my mother asked for 5 private minutes. She told me she'd spent my whole childhood assuming the daughter who asked for less needed less. Sloane's constant demands made her feel necessary. My independence made her feel irrelevant. Instead of sitting with that, she'd punished me for managing without her. It was the first honest thing she'd said in the whole process. I told her understanding the reason didn't erase the choice. She'd crossed the distance between favoritism and fraud one deliberate step at a time. The spare key, the stolen ID, the fake email, the forged deed, the lie to escrow, the raised glass. The first harvest after Miller Creek came back to me started 11 months after that grand opening. We'd lost a season of planning and part of our certification timeline, but not the trees. I promoted Hector to operations director, restored the benefits that had lapsed during the dispute, and revised the plan so the orchard could stay profitable without ever needing to sell its identity to a resort company again. I also started an apprenticeship fund in Grandpa Walter's name for young growers learning soil restoration and water management. My inheritance stopped being something I only defended. It became something I got to extend. I changed the systems that had let family access turn into business authority. My mother's spare key got destroyed. Every account now needs 2-step approval, and Priya helped place the acreage under a conservation structure that makes a rushed transfer without independent review impossible. None of it feels sentimental, but it's its own kind of care. Grandpa trusted my judgment. Honoring that meant building protection sturdier than trust alone. I kept the forged deed in a locked file, not as a trophy, but as proof that love without limits can be rewritten into permission by anyone determined enough. At sunset the day I hosted my first harvest dinner back on my own land, my mother sent one message, asking to visit, saying she wanted to stand where Grandpa Walter used to stand. Months earlier, that request would have filled me with guilt. This time I read it without confusing the two. I replied, "The orchard doesn't have room for people who never learned to value it," put my phone away, and went back to the table. I didn't feel triumphant when it showed as read. I felt clear. For most of my life, my mother had counted on the gap between hurting me and my willingness to name it out loud. That gap is gone now. She can regret the settlement, the probation, or the apology she had to send around, but access to me was never going to be something she could negotiate her way back into.